Good morning. Hopefully you'll be able to hear me over the sound of the storm outside. If you would, go ahead and open up to Psalm 13. That's where we're going to be spending our time today. Psalm 13. And we've looked at a couple of other types of psalms so far, but this morning we're looking at psalms that are prayers, and there are several of those, and we'll talk about it obviously as we go through. But part of the reason that we're doing this, looking at different classifications of psalms within the book of Psalms, is because we want to see them as individuals, and we want to spend more time in them than just the amount of time it takes to read through the passage, as we probably so often do. And so we're going to try to appreciate this class of psalms as a whole, prayer psalms, but also this psalm number 13 in particular. And so the psalms, as we've pointed out before, are really just a song book for the Jews. They would sing most of these, at least, for different occasions, and they were set to actual tunes, and they would sing along with them. And so it's not all that different from what we do today. A lot of the Psalms seem quite similar, but most of them do have different intentions, and even if they are very similar, they still have different circumstances in which they were written. But we don't always know what those circumstances are. But in particular with this psalm, it is a psalm of David, which means that we know at least that much about it. But other than that, we don't know just a whole lot of what was going on in his life at this point. Now, that being said, there's a lot that happened in David's life. We talked about one episode of it this morning where his son Absalom dies after having rebelled, after having killed one of David's other sons. And so there's no shortage of grief in David's life that he could find himself needing to be comforted for, but also to pray for. And there are plenty of reasons why he might say the words that he does in this particular psalm as we'll look through it. But we understand that he had plenty to be sorrowful about, plenty that needed to be prayed about. But there are other psalms that are like this one, other prayer psalms, and they are exactly what they sound like. They are a prayer that is written out and that, at the time at least, was set to music. And in this case, David probably writes the song as well, or writes the tune to the song as well as the words. But other prayer psalms, just to run through it quickly, and you can ask me later if you really want to know what they are, but Psalm 6, Psalm 12 is in the one right before this. Psalm 22 is probably the best known of the prayer psalms. Psalm 31, 39, 44, 74, 79, and more than that. But they will follow a similar pattern, a similar style to one another, and so we'll talk about that pattern as well. But these are prayer psalms. They're their own kind of classification, and maybe it's that we have gone back and added this classification to them, but they do have these things in common, and so they can help us, at least mentally, to connect different psalms with one another. And so with this psalm, Psalm 13, again, a psalm of David, we do find the pattern for prayer psalms. So what is the pattern? Well, the pattern is that there is a problem that is brought up. And so the author is going to lay out whatever his problem is before God, because that's how we generally operate with our prayers as well. But whatever their woes are in life, whatever their situation is, they will explain it, at least in certain terms. Now, in this case, and in many of them actually, it's not described in detail as to the actual events that are happening. Instead, the psalmist describes his reaction to them. He describes how he is feeling, not necessarily the actual events that took place. And so we're left to try to guess as to what that is. But that is the problem. And so the first couple verses here will explain the problem that David has at this time, or at least how he's feeling about it. The second thing that'll happen is a plea for help. And so that is the prayer part. It's the petition part. It's where you ask God for something. And so you lay out the problem and you say, God, this is what I need in particular to help at this time. And then the third part is a profession of faith, of trust. It's just the the author of the psalm saying, God, I know that you've done this before and I need your help now. And so we'll talk about these a little bit more in detail. Now, obviously, this pattern is not always perfectly followed, and a lot of times it's out of order, but it's going to be there. Those elements will be there. And so the first part of this, like we said, are the problems that are lined out. In the first couple verses, let's read verses 1 and 2. It says, how long, O Lord, will you forget me? Forever? How long will you hide your face from me? How long shall I take counsel in my own soul, having sorrow in my heart daily? How long will my enemy be exalted over me? This is David's problem. It's actually a series of problems that he's pointing out. But again, he doesn't tell us what the problem is. What he tells us is how he feels about it. And so he says that he is forgotten. He asks God, will you continue to forget me? Has God, in fact, from a theological standpoint, has he forgotten David? Has he ever forgotten any person? He's not. But at the same time, we said that David is expressing not the actual events, but he's expressing his feelings. Is it possible for a human to feel that God has forgotten them? It's possible. You may have experienced that yourself, where you've been asking for something to be done through prayer, or maybe it's just that your life has become so difficult and you say, well, has God forgotten about me? Why are all of these bad things happening just to me? And it is kind of personal, and it's not quite woe is me, but there is a heavily personal aspect to all of this prayer that David is making here. So he says, how long will you forget me? But then he also asks the question, how long shall I take counsel in my soul? Which is essentially saying, how long should I have to comfort myself? How long do I have to be my own source of counsel instead of the Lord responding to me? And so he makes this plea as well. He also says that he has sorrow in his heart daily. Now that is, again, given David's life, probably realistic. Imagine he writes this after the events, kind of like we talked about last Monday night, after the events with Absalom. If he writes it then, he's got a pretty good reason. What if he writes this after the death of his son that he has with Bathsheba? Does he have sorrow in his heart daily? Yeah, I imagine. What if he writes this earlier in life, whenever he's on the run from King Saul, who's trying to kill him again and again? Does he have sorrow? Does he have reason to be sorrowful? He sure does. So David has these problems. He has sadness, he has grief, bordering on depression likely, and that by itself could be a problem apart from whatever else is going on. And the third thing he says at the end of verse 3, well, he asks as a question, how long will my enemy be exalted over me? How long will the people outside of my own group keep afflicting me in this way? Now again, we don't know what he's talking about specifically, but he had plenty of enemies. Most of the kingdoms around David were hostile toward Israel, and so it's possible he means this in the most literal sense, that they're enemy nations who are warring against him. It could mean that he has political opponents who are trying to take power from him. Again, we see this with his son Absalom. We also see it later with his son Adonijah. And so he has people who are always wanting to take his power. Maybe he means it more spiritually or religiously, talking about Satan as the adversary. That could work. Or maybe it's something more general than that, just a feeling of defeat rather than one particular enemy. But we don't really know. But here's the thing about this psalm, or any psalm that is describing a situation in feelings and doesn't give us the details. Do we know what David was going through at this time? We don't. Why? Because he didn't tell us everything. Does God know what David was going through at this time? If God only has access to the same words here, does he know what David's going through? Absolutely. Even if we describe in our prayers just the way that we feel in response to something that's happened, God knows already not just the feelings we have, but he even knows the situation that we're praying about. And so God is perfectly aware of what David is in need of, even in this psalm, that we've lost its meaning over the last 2,000 years. The second part, like we said, is a plea for help. And so in verse 3, David says, "Consider and hear me, O Lord my God. Enlighten my eyes, lest I sleep the sleep of death. lest my enemies say, I have prevailed against him, and lest those who trouble me rejoice when I am moved. This is the response then. If this is the situation, now we get to say, well, God, help me address the situation that I'm in. And so he'll make this plea starting with, hear me, O Lord my God. Hear me. Well, why does he say that? Because at the beginning, he just mentioned that he felt that he'd been forgotten, that God isn't listening to him. And so his first prayer is, God, hear my prayer. Well, that's a pretty good thing to pray, I guess, especially if you feel that you aren't being heard. And so again, God does in fact hear. He's heard the whole time everything that David has said, but in the situation, David feels that this is necessary to pray. He also says to brighten my eyes, which is, it can be taken different ways, but he says if you don't answer my prayer, then that's one of the results. If you don't brighten my eyes, then these will be the results. If you don't give me life, in a sense, then these will be the results. One, that I will sleep the sleep of death. Well, that's a pretty obvious reference to his own death. Now, to us, that might sound dramatic, especially if we read it just without context and say, well, David, calm down just a little bit. Things are probably okay. Well, what if they're not? Again, what if he writes this when he's on the run from Absalom? And if he's found, he'll be killed. What if he writes this when he's on the run from Saul? And if Saul finds him, he'll be killed. What happens then? And so it may be that David means this in the most literal sense possible. It may mean that David, if God does not answer David's prayer, David really will be killed by whoever his enemy is. That's just one of the two results that he's trying to avoid. The other is that if I am not helped by the Lord, my enemies will say, I have prevailed against him. Okay, so why does it matter if David's enemies rejoice and if they think that they have won a victory over him? What David's doing is using a similar logic to what we see Moses use back in Exodus, specifically chapter 32, starting in verse 11. Moses there says, Lord, if you brought us up out of Egypt and now we perish from the earth, then what's going to happen? Well, all the people are going to say, oh, the Israelites, those were those people that their God couldn't really save them. And so it almost sounds manipulative on the part of David or of Moses, but it's just reminding God, you've made this promise to help me, and I'm kind of calling in the favor now, and pointing out that if nothing else, it won't just be damaging to me in that David here might die, it'll also be damaging to the reputation of God. And there is some truth to that, and so David points it out here. The last part of this, as we mentioned, is that this is a sort of praise of God or a professing of trust in God. And so he starts out, verse 5, he says, but I have trusted in your mercy, and my heart shall rejoice in your salvation. That's about as general as you can get in terms of praising God, but mercy and salvation are the things that he seems to be seeking in this prayer. He wants God's mercy on him to prevent whatever evils might be coming his way, and he wants salvation. He wants to be saved, not in the modern sense that we think of religiously, but he wants to be saved from, helped out of the situation that he's in. And so those are the things that he is trusting in God to do. He's trusted in both the mercy and the salvation of the Lord. And his response then, after this, is verse 6, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. I think that verse 6 is probably looking into the future. It's kind of saying, I will sing to the Lord once he has delivered me from this. Not that he can't sing in the meantime, but for those who are cheerful, you should sing. And so it's the natural response here. A couple things with this. One, God even uses this same logic that David uses here in verses 5 and 6. God, again, going back to the days of Exodus, he will remind his people that he is powerful, not just in general, but that he has done great things for them in the past. And that's kind of what David points to here. He says, I've trusted your mercy in the past. I've trusted in your salvation in the past, and you've brought me out of a lot of difficult situations. And in prayer psalms, that's kind of the idea. It's not just a general statement of faith to say, well, God, I know that you have mercy and you can provide salvation. Instead, he's saying, God, you've done it before. Do it again. And so again, God, back in the days of Exodus, says, am I not the God of, one, your ancestors, Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob? You remember how I dealt with them. But am I not also the God that brought you out of the land of Egypt, that led you across the Red Sea on dry ground? The one that drove out the kings of the Canaanites before you? God says, I've done it all before. Trust me now. And David in this psalm says, God, you've done it all before, and I'm going to trust you now. And he says that I will sing to the Lord. Verse 6 could be a lesson by itself on the value of singing. Because when we sing, hopefully we're not singing just because there's a book in front of us that has some notes in it. Hopefully we're not singing just because the person next to us is singing and we think it'd be kind of awkward if we stopped. David gives the reason to sing to the Lord in verse 6. He says, I will sing to the Lord because he has dealt bountifully with me. Why do we gather to sing every Sunday and even Wednesday and other times that we get together? Why do we sing to the Lord? Because he's been gracious to us. He's given us everything that he has, everything that we need, more than we need. We sing because he's dealt bountifully with each of us. What else can we take from this psalm? One, and we've kind of danced around this the whole time, the question might be raised, is this psalm or this prayer really from David, is it any good, or is it David just kind of complaining? Because when we read through it, there is a lot of complaint. He's saying, well, here's how bad my life is. And God, I need you to do this. If you don't do it, I'll die. And I've trusted you before, and you better do it again. Well, that is a way of looking at it, but it's probably the least generous way of looking at it. And so when we read these words from David, if we take him, as we described in class, as a man after God's own heart, perhaps because of the tenderness of his own heart as God's is toward his children, or whatever way in which God means that, David, it must be acknowledged that David's life was awful a lot of the time. And since it was awful a lot of the time, he does have maybe a little bit more room to speak than we do. I don't know how many of you have ever had your father-in-law, the king, try to kill you. Has that ever happened to you? Maybe it has. I hope not. But how many of you have ever had your son steal your house, steal your bank account, steal a couple of your wives? Has that ever happened to you? David has some room to be upset. Now, that doesn't mean he can speak out of turn toward God, but he does have some room to complain. And so with this, it is a balance. And David does try to bring this back into balance by the end of the psalm here, that God's ways are beyond our own understanding, certainly, but that David, Job, Habakkuk, a lot of characters in the Bible question God just enough to maybe get the point across to say, God, I need help. And in the situation that they're in, they find help from God. And we could even put Jesus maybe into that category as well. He shows a little bit of this same example when in the garden he says, God, if you can change your mind, if you can make this a little bit easier, that'd be great. If not, that's okay. And I think at least in part, that's what verse 5 can mean here as well. David says, my life is awful. If you don't help me, I'll die. And everybody will make fun of me once I've been killed. My enemies will rejoice over me. But in verse 5, he says, but if that happens, I've trusted in your mercy. If that happens, my heart shall rejoice in your salvation anyway. So David does speak a little bit harshly maybe toward God here, but he does bring it back around. But really the point is, when facing hard times, the only thing that we can do in response as people of God is to draw closer to him. And that's what David does here. If David were not a man after God's own heart, perhaps he doesn't even pray to God. But instead, he prays to God, he writes it down, and people have read it thousands, millions, even more times for the last 2,000 years. actually even more than 2,000 years. But one other thing we want to say is that in looking at the Psalms, again, we want to make sure that we separate them. I do understand that if you just read through the book of Psalms at a pretty quick pace, then they all sound the same. And there's a lot of the same flowery language and even the same phrases that get used, but they are individuals and they have to be treated that way. And so this morning we've taken a look at Psalm 13. How many of you have ever spent more than about 30 seconds reading from verse 1 through verse 6? Have you ever spent more time than that in this psalm? I don't know that I have, because that's not what we usually do, but we want to. We want to take a deeper look into each part of God's Word, even just these 6 verses, as we've done now. But that also applies not just to the Psalms that we read in the Old Testament, but also to the songs that we sing even today. And so there are songs that sound a whole lot like this, by the way, that we do sing, at least from time to time. We sing songs that say, tempted and tried, we're oft made to wonder why it should be thus all the day long. That's a song pretty much like this one that says, God, why is it like this? Why is it so difficult? And yet, farther along, we'll trust that we'll know more about it. So we sing songs like that, or we sing other songs. Another example would be, where can I go but to the Lord? It's that same kind of question of saying, well, things aren't so great here, but where can I turn to? And David finds the same answer that we do, that we can only turn to God as our solution to whatever the problem may be. One other suggestion that we can make is that we can take this psalm and apply it maybe more directly to ourselves by, at least some of the time, like we said with Psalms of Praise, we can make our prayer reflect this structure of a psalm, which I think we get the first 2 parts down pretty well, right? We're pretty good about telling God what our problem is, and we're pretty good about telling Him what we want from Him. What if we add this third part that says, you know what, God, here's my problem, here's what I want you to do about it, but also, God, just for a minute, let me reflect and think, when's the last time I was in a situation kind of like this one? And God, what did you do to help? And how did you get me through that time? And how can that build my faith to what you will do for me this time around too? And so certainly that can be the way that we look at this, and should be. That if we're patient, that God will get us through just as He has in times past. That being said, the one exception is that God will not always pull us through whatever the situation is. One example of that comes from the death of Wayne's father-in-law. You think that was the prayer, especially initially when that news was given? It's never the prayer that we want. But even when that happens, God is still in control. Even when that happens, we still have trusted in His mercy, and we still rejoice in His salvation. We aren't promised that God will always answer our prayers favorably, is the point. And that being true, we know that God has not guaranteed us success in life. He's not even guaranteed us any more life than we've lived up to this point. This morning, you have an opportunity that may not be available to you later on, but you have an opportunity that, since God does not guarantee that life will always be successful, that's okay, but we recognize that He will guarantee that if we are in Him, then our death can be successful in its own right. It can be a reward in and of itself after this life is over. But this morning, if that's not something that you're confident in, this morning, if you need something as far as prayers like we've talked about this morning from the church, that would be appropriate. Or if there's any other need that you have, we ask you to come forward now as we stand, as we sing.